Chapter 1. A Noiseless Flash. At exactly 15 minutes past 8 in the morning on August 6th, 1945, Japanese time, at the moment when the atomic bomb flashed above Hiroshima, Miss Toshiko Sasaki, a clerk in the personal department of the East Asia Tin Works, had just sat down at her place in the plant office and was turning her head to speak to the girl at the next desk. At that same moment, Dr. Masakazu Fuji was settling down cross-legged to read the Osaka Asahi on the porch of his private hospital, overhanging one of the seven deltaic rivers which divide Hiroshima. Mrs. Natsuyo Nakamura, a tailor's widow, stood by the window of her kitchen, watching a neighbor tearing down his house because it lay in the path of an air raid defense fire lane. Father Wilhelm Kleinsorch, a German priest of the Society of Jesus, reclined in his underwear on a cot on the top floor of his order's three-story mission house, reading a Jesuit magazine, Stimmen der Zeit. Dr. Terafumi Sasaki, a young member of the surgical staff of the city's large modern Red Cross hospital, walked along one of the hospital corridors with a blood specimen for a Wassermann test in his hand, and the Reverend Mr. Kiyoshi Tanimoto, pastor of the Hiroshima Methodist Church, paused at the door of a rich man's house in Koi, the city's western suburb, and prepared to unload a handcart full of things he had evacuated from town in fear of the massive B-29 raid which everyone expected Hiroshima to suffer. 100,000 people were killed by the atomic bomb, and these 6 were among the survivors. They still wonder why they lived when so many others died. Each of them counts many small items of chance or volition, a step taken in time, a decision to go indoors, catching one streetcar instead of the next, that spared them. And now each knows that in the act of survival, he lived a dozen lives and saw more death than he ever thought he would see. At the time, none of them knew anything. The Reverend Mr. Tanimoto got up at 5 o'clock that morning. He was alone in the parsonage, because for some time his wife had been commuting with their year-old baby to spend nights with a friend in Ushida, a suburb to the north. Of all the important cities of Japan, only 2, Kyoto and Hiroshima, had not been visited in the strength by B-san, or Mr. B, as the Japanese with a mixture of respect and unhappy familiarity called the B-29. And Mr. Tanimoto, like all his neighbors and friends, was almost sick with anxiety. He had heard uncomfortably detailed accounts of mass raids on Kure, Iwakuni, Tokuyama, and other nearby towns. He was sure Hiroshima's turn would come soon. He had slept badly the night before, because there had been several air raid warnings. Hiroshima had been getting such warnings almost every night for weeks, for at that time, the B-29s were using Lake Biwa, northeast of Hiroshima, as a rendezvous point. And no matter what city the Americans planned to hit, the super fortresses streamed in over the coast near Hiroshima. The frequency of the warnings and the continued abstinence of Mr. B with respect to Hiroshima had made its citizens jittery. A rumor was going around that the Americans were saving something special for the city. Mr. Tanimoto was a small man, quick to laugh and cry. He wore his black hair parted in the middle and rather long. The prominence of the frontal bones just above his eyebrows and the smallness of his mustache, mouth, and chin gave him a strange, old young look, boyish and yet wise, weak and yet fiery. He moved nervously and fast, but with a restraint which suggested that he was a cautious, thoughtful man. He showed, indeed, just those qualities in the uneasy days before the bomb fell. Besides having his wife spend the nights in Ushida, Mr. Tanimoto had been carrying all the portable things from his church in the close-packed residential district called Nagaragawa to a house that belonged to a rayon manufacturer in Koi, 2 miles from the center of town. The rayon man, a Mr. Matsui, had opened his then unoccupied estate to a large number of his friends and acquaintances, so that they might evacuate whatever they wished to a safe distance from the probable target area. Mr. Tanimoto had had no difficulty in moving chairs, hymnals, Bibles, altar gear, and church records by pushcart himself, but the organ console and an upright piano required some aid. A friend of his, named Matsuo, had the day before helped him get the piano out to Koi. In return, he had promised this day to assist Mr. Matsuo in hauling out a daughter's belongings. That is why he had risen so early. Mr. Tanimoto cooked his own breakfast. He felt awfully tired. The effort of moving the piano the day before, a sleepless night, weeks of worry, and unbalanced diet, the cares of his parish, all combined to make him feel hardly adequate to the new day's work. There was another thing, too. Mr. Tanimoto had studied theology at Emory College in Atlanta, Georgia. He had graduated in 1940. He spoke excellent English. He dressed in American clothes. He had corresponded with many American friends right up to the time the war began. And among a people obsessed with fear of being spied upon, perhaps almost obsessed himself, he found himself growing increasingly uneasy. The police had questioned him several times, and just a few days before, he had heard that an influential acquaintance, a Mr. Tanaka, a retired officer of the Toyo Kisen Kaisha steamship line, an anti-Christian, a man famous in Hiroshima for his showy philanthropies and notorious for his personal tyrannies, had been telling people that Tanimoto should not be trusted. In compensation, to show himself publicly a good Japanese, Mr. Tanimoto had taken on the chairmanship of his local Tonarigumi, or neighborhood association, and to his other duties and concerns, this position had added the business of organizing air raid defenses for about 20 families. Before 6 o'clock that morning, Mr. Tanimoto started for Mr. Matsuo's house. There, he found that their burden was to be a tansu, a large Japanese cabinet full of clothing and household goods. The two men set out. The morning was perfectly clear and so warm that the day promised to be uncomfortable. A few minutes after they started, the air raid siren went off, a minute-long blast that warned of approaching planes but indicated to the people of Hiroshima only a slight degree of danger, since it sounded every morning at this time when an American weather plane came over. The two men pulled and pushed the handcart through the city streets. Hiroshima was a fan-shaped city, lying mostly on the 6 islands formed by the 7 estuarial rivers that branched out from the Ota River. Its main commercial and residential districts, covering about 4 square miles in the center of the city, contained 3/4 of its population, which had been reduced by several evacuation programs from a wartime peak of 380,000 to about 245,000. Factories and other residential districts, or suburbs, lay compactly around the edges of the city. To the south were the docks, an airport, and the island-studded inland sea. A rim of mountains runs around the other 3 sides of the delta. Mr. Tanimoto and Mr. Matsuo took their way through the shopping center, already full of people, and across 2 of the rivers to the sloping streets of Koi, and up them to the outskirts and foothills. As they started up a valley away from the tight-ranked houses, the all-clear sounded. The Japanese radar operators detected only 3 planes, supposed that they comprised a reconnaissance. Pushing the handcart up to the Ryan man's house was tiring, and the men, after they had maneuvered their load into the driveway and to the front steps, paused to rest a while. They stood with a wing of the house between them and the city. Like most homes in this part of Japan, the house consisted of a wooden frame and wooden walls supporting a heavy tile roof. Its front hall, packed with rolls of bedding and clothing, looked like a cool cave full of fat cushions. Opposite the house, to the right of the front door, was a large, finicky rock garden. There was no sound of planes. The morning was still. The place was cool and pleasant. Then a tremendous flash of light cut across the sky. Mr. Tanimoto has a distinct recollection that it traveled from east to west, from the city towards the hills. It seemed a sheet of sun. Both he and Mr. Matsuo reacted in terror, and both had time to react, for they were 3,500 yards, or 2 miles, from the center of the explosion. Mr. Matsuo dashed up the front steps into the house and dived among the bedrolls and buried himself there. Mr. Tanimoto took 4 or 5 steps and threw himself between 2 rocks in the garden. He bellied up very hard against one of them. As his face was against the stone, he did not see what happened. He felt a sudden pressure, and then splinters and pieces of board and fragments of tile fell on him. He heard no roar. Almost no one in Hiroshima recalls hearing any noise of the bomb. But a fisherman in his sampan on the inland sea near Tsuzu, the man with whom Mr. Tanimoto's mother-in-law and sister-in-law were living, saw the flash and heard a tremendous explosion. He was nearly 20 miles from Hiroshima, but the thunder was greater than when the B-29s hit Iwakuni, only 5 miles away. When he dared, Mr. Tanimoto raised his head and saw that the Ryan man's house had collapsed. He thought a bomb had fallen directly on it. Such clouds of dust had risen that there was a sort of twilight around. In panic, not thinking for the moment of Mr. Matsuo under the ruins, he dashed out into the streets. He noticed as he ran that the concrete wall of the estate had fallen over, toward the house, rather than away from it. In the street, the first thing he saw was a squad of soldiers who had been burrowing into the hillside opposite, making one of the thousands of dugouts in which the Japanese apparently intended to resist invasion, hill by hill, life for life. The soldiers were coming out of the hole, where they should have been safe, and blood was running from their heads, chests, and backs, and they were silent dazed. Under what seemed to be a local dust cloud, the day grew darker and darker. At nearly midnight, the night before the bomb was dropped, an announcer on the city's radio station said that about 200 B 29s were approaching southern Ohonchu and advised the population of Hiroshima to evacuate to their designated safe areas. Mrs. Hatsuyo Nakamura, the tailor's widow who lived in the section called Noboricho and who had long had a habit of doing as she was told, got her three children, a 10-year-old boy, Toshio, an 8-year-old girl, Yaeko, and a 5-year-old girl, Mieko, out of bed and dressed them and walked with them to the military area known as the East Parade Ground on the northeast edge of the city. There she unrolled some mats and the children lay down on them. They slept until about 2, when they were awakened by the roar of the planes going over Hiroshima. As soon as the planes had passed, Mrs. Nakamura started back with her children. They reached home a little after 2:30, and she immediately turned on the radio, which, to her distress, was just then broadcasting a fresh warning. When she looked at the children and saw how tired they were, and when she thought of the number of trips they had made in the past weeks, all to no purpose, to the East Parade Ground, she decided that in spite of the instructions on the radio, she simply could not face starting out all over again. She put the children in their bedrolls on the floor, lay down herself at 3 o'clock, and fell asleep at once, so soundly that when planes passed over later, she did not awaken to their sound. The siren jarred her awake at about 7. She arose, dressed quickly, and hurried to the house of Mr. Nakamoto, the head of her neighborhood association, and asked him what she should do. He said that she should remain at home unless an urgent warning, a series of intermittent blasts of the siren, was sounded. She returned home, lit the stove in the kitchen, set some rice to cook, and sat down to read that morning's Hiroshima Chugoku. To her relief, that all clear sounded at 8 o'clock. She heard the children stirring, so she went and gave each of them a handful of peanuts and told them to stay on their bedrolls, because they were tired from the night's walk. She had hoped that they would go back to sleep, but the man in the house directly to the south began to make a terrible hullabaloo of hammering, wedging, ripping, and splitting. The prefectural government, convinced, as everyone in Hiroshima was, that the city would be attacked soon, had begun to press with threats and warnings for the completion of wide fire lanes, which it had hoped might act in conjunction with the river to localize any fires started by an incendiary raid, and the neighbor was reluctantly sacrificing his home to the city's safety. Just the day before, the prefecture had ordered all able-bodied girls from the secondary schools to spend a few days helping to clear the lanes, and they started work soon after the all-clear sounded. Mrs. Nakamura went back to the kitchen, looked at the rice, and began watching the man next door. At first, she was annoyed with him for making so much noise, but then she was moved almost to tears by pity. Her emotion was specifically directed towards her neighbor, tearing down his home, board by board, at a time where there was so much unavoidable destruction. But undoubtedly, she also felt a generalized community pity, to say nothing of self-pity. She had not had an easy time. Her husband, Isawa, had gone into the army just after Miyako was born, and she had heard nothing from or of him for a long time, until on March 5th, 1942, she received a 7-word telegram. Isawa died in honorable battle at Singapore. She learned later that he had died on February 15th, the day Singapore fell, and that he had been a corporal. Isawa had been a not particularly prosperous tailor, and his only capital was a sankoku sewing machine. After his death, when his allotments stopped coming, Mrs. Nakamura got out the machine and began to take in piecework herself, and since then had supported the children, but poorly, by sewing. As Mrs. Nakamura stood watching her neighbor, everything flashed whiter than any white she had ever seen. She did not notice what happened to the man next door. The reflex of a mother set in her motion towards her children. She had taken a single step. The house was 1,350 yards, or 3/4 of a mile, from the center of the explosion, when something picked her up and she seemed to fly into the next room, over the raised sleeping platform, pursued by parts of her house. Timbers fell around her as she landed, and a shower of tiles pummeled her. Everything became dark, for she was buried. The debris did not cover her deeply. She rose up and freed herself. She heard a child cry, "Mother, help me!" and saw her youngest, Mieko, the 5-year-old, buried up to her breast and unable to move. And as Mrs. Nakamura started frantically to claw her way towards the baby, she could see or hear nothing of her other children. In the days right before the bombing, Dr. Masakazu Fuji, being prosperous, hedonistic, and at the time not too busy, had been allowing himself the luxury of sleeping until 9 or 9:30. But fortunately, he had to get up early the morning the bomb was dropped to see a house guest off on a train. He rose at 6 and half an hour later walked with his friend to the station, not far away, across two of the rivers. He was back home by 7, just as the siren sounded its sustained warning. He ate breakfast and then, because the morning was already hot, undressed down to his underwear and went out on the porch to read the paper. This porch, in fact, the whole building, was curiously constructed. Dr. Fuji was the proprietor of a peculiarly Japanese institution, a private, single doctor hospital. This building, perched beside and over the water of the Kyo River, and next to the bridge of the same name, contained 30 rooms for 30 patients and their kinfolk. For, according to Japanese custom, when a person falls sick and goes to a hospital, one or more members of his family go and live there with him, to cook for him, bathe, massage, and read to him, and to offer incessant familial sympathy, without which a Japanese patient would be miserable indeed. Dr. Fuji had no beds, only straw mats for his patients. He did, however, have all sorts of modern equipment, an X-ray machine, diathermy apparatus, and a fine tiled laboratory. The structure rested two-thirds on the land and one-third on piles over the tidal waters of the Kyo. This overhang, the part of the building where Dr. Fuji lived, was queer-looking, but it was cool in the summer and from the porch, which faced away from the center of the city. The prospect of the river, with pleasure boats drifting up and down it, was always refreshing. Dr. Fuji had occasionally had anxious moments when the Ota and its mouth branches rose to flood, but the piling was apparently firm enough and the house had always held. Dr. Fuji had been relatively idle for about a month because in July, as the number of untouched cities in Japan dwindled and as Hiroshima seemed more and more inevitable as a target, he began turning patients away on the ground that in case of a fire raid, he would not be able to evacuate them. Now, he had only two patients left, a woman from Yano, injured in the shoulder, and a young man of 25 recovering from burns he had suffered when the steel factory near Hiroshima in which he worked had been hit. Dr. Fuji had 6 nurses to tend to his patients. His wife and children were safe. His wife and one son were living outside Osaka, and another son and 2 daughters were in the country on Kyushu. A niece was living with him, and a maid and a manservant. He had little to do and did not mind, for he had saved some money. At 50, he was wealthy, convivial, and calm, and he was pleased to pass the evenings drinking whiskey with friends, always sensibly, and for the sake of conversation. Before the war, he had affected brands imported from Scotland and America. Now he was perfectly satisfied with the best Japanese brand, Suntory. Dr. Fuji sat down cross-legged in his underwear on the spotless matting of the porch, put on his glasses, and started reading the Osaka Asahi. He liked to read the Osaka news because his wife was there. He saw the flash. To him, faced away from the center and looking at his paper, it seemed a brilliant yellow. Startled, he began to rise to his feet. In that moment, he was 1,550 yards from the center. The hospital leaned behind his rising and, with a terrible ripping noise, toppled into the river. The doctor, still in the act of getting to his feet, was thrown forward and around and over. He was buffeted and gripped. He lost track of everything because things were so sped up. He felt the water. Dr. Fuji hardly had time to think that he was dying before he realized that he was alive, squeezed tightly by 2 long timbers in a V across his chest, like a morsel suspended between 2 huge chopsticks. Held upright so that he could not move, with his head miraculously above water and his torso and legs in it. The remains of his hospital were all around him, in a mad assortment of splintered lumber and materials for the relief of pain. His left shoulder hurt terribly. His glasses were gone. Father Wilhelm Kleinsorge, of the Society of Jesus, was, on the morning of the explosion, in rather frail condition. The Japanese wartime diet had not sustained him, and he felt the strain of being a foreigner in an increasingly xenophobic Japan. Even a German, since the defeat of the fatherland, was unpopular. Father Kleinsorge had, at 38, the look of a boy growing too fast, thin in the face, with a prominent Adam's apple, a hollow chest, dangling hands, big feet. He walked clumsily, leaning forward a little. He was tired all the time. To make things worse, he had suffered for 2 days, along with Father Cheislik, a fellow priest, from a rather painful and urgent diarrhea, which they blamed on the beans and black ration bread they were obliged to eat. 2 other priests, then living in the mission compound, which was in the Noboricho section, Father Superior LaSalle and Father Schaeffer had happily escaped this affliction. Father Kleinsorge woke up about 6 the morning the bomb was dropped, and half an hour later, he was a bit tardy because of his sickness. He began to read Mass in the mission chapel, a small Japanese style wooden building which was without pews, since its worship was knelt on the usual Japanese matted floor, facing an altar braced with splendid silks, brass, silver, and heavy embroideries. This morning, on Monday, the only worshippers were Mr. Takemoto, a theological student living in the mission house, Mr. Fukai, the secretary of the diocese, Mrs. Murata, the mission's devoutly Christian housekeeper, and his fellow priests. After Mass, while Father Kleinsorge was reading the prayers of thanksgiving, the sirens sounded. He stopped the service, and the missionaries retired across the compound to the bigger building. There, in his room on the ground floor, to the right of the front door, Father Kleinsorge changed into a military uniform, which he had acquired when he was teaching at the Roko Middle School in Kobe, which he wore during air raid alerts. After an alarm, Father Kleinsorge always went out and scanned the sky, and in this instance, when he stopped outside, he was glad to see only the single weather plane that flew over Hiroshima each day about this time. Satisfied that nothing would happen, he went in and breakfasted with the other fathers on substitute coffee and ration bread, which, under the circumstances, was especially repugnant to him. The fathers sat and talked a while until, at 8, they heard the all clear. They went then to various parts of the building. Father Schaeffer retired to his room to do some writing. Father Cheislik sat in his room in a straight chair with a pillow over his stomach to ease his pain and read. Father Superior LaSalle stood at the window of his room, thinking. Father Kleinsorge went up to a room on the third floor, took off all his clothes except his underwear, and stretched out on his right side on a cot, and began reading his Stimmen der Zeit. After the terrible flash, which Father Kleinsorge later realized reminded him of something he had read as a boy about a large meteor colliding with the Earth, he had time, since he was 1,400 yards from the center, for one thought. A bomb had fallen directly on us. Then, for a few seconds or minutes, he went out of his mind. Father Kleinsorge never knew how he got out of the house. The next things he was conscious of were that he was wandering around in the mission's vegetable garden in his underwear, leading slightly from small cuts along his left flank, that all the buildings around had fallen down except the Jesuits' mission house, which had long been braced and double braced by a priest named Groper, who was terrified of earthquakes, that the day had turned dark, and that Murata-san, the housekeeper, was nearby crying over and over, Shu Jesusu, awarami tamai, our Jesus Lord, have pity on us. On the train on the way into Hiroshima from the country where he lived with his mother, Dr. Terafumi Sasaki, the Red Cross hospital surgeon, thought over an unpleasant nightmare he had had the night before. His mother's home was in Mukaihara, 30 miles from the city, and it took him 2 hours by train and tram to reach the hospital. He had slept uneasily all night and had wakened an hour earlier than usual, and, feeling slightly sluggish and slightly feverish, had debated whether to go to the hospital at all. His sense of duty finally forced him to go, and he had started out on an earlier train than he took most mornings. The dream had particularly frightened him, because it was so closely associated, on the surface at least, with a disturbing actuality. He was only 25 years old, and had just completed his training at the Eastern Medical University in Tsingtao, China. He was something of an idealist, and was much distressed by the inadequacy of medical facilities in the country town where his mother lived. Quite on his own, and without a permit, he had begun visiting a few sick people out there in the evenings, after his 8 hours at the hospital and 4 hours commuting. He had recently learned that the penalty for practicing without a permit was severe. A fellow doctor whom he had asked about it had given him a serious scolding. Nevertheless, he had continued to practice. In his dream, he had been at the bedside of a country patient when the police and the doctor he had consulted burst into the room, seized him, dragged him outside, and beat him up cruelly. On the train, he had just about decided to give up work in Mukaihara, since he had felt it would be impossible to get a permit, because the authorities would hold that it would conflict with his duties at the Red Cross. At the terminus, he caught a streetcar at once. He later calculated that if he had taken his customary train that morning, and if he had to wait a few minutes for the streetcar, as often happened, he would have been close to the center at the time of the explosion and would surely have perished. He arrived at the hospital at 7:40 and reported to the chief surgeon. A few minutes later, he went to a room on the first floor and drew blood from the arm of a man in order to perform a Wassermann test. The laboratory containing the incubators for the test was on the third floor. With the blood specimen in his left hand, walking in a kind of distraction he had felt all morning, probably because of the dream and his restless night, he started along the main corridor on his way towards the stairs. He was one step beyond an open window when the light of the bomb was reflected, like a gigantic photographic flash, in the corridor. He dug down on one knee and said to himself, as only a Japanese would, Sasaki, gambare, be brave. Just then, the building was 1,650 yards from the center. The blast ripped through the hospital. The glasses he was wearing flew off his face. The bottle of blood crashed against one wall. His Japanese slippers slipped out from under his feet, but otherwise, thanks to where he stood, he was untouched. Dr. Sasaki shouted the name of the chief surgeon and rushed around to the man's office and found him terribly cut by glass. The hospital was in terrible confusion. Heavy partitions and ceilings had fallen on patients, beds had overturned, windows had blown in and cut people. Blood was spattered on the walls and floors. Instruments were everywhere. Many of the patients were running around screaming. Many more lay dead. A colleague working in the laboratory to which Dr. Sasaki had been walking was dead. Dr. Sasaki's patient, whom he had just left and who a few moments before had been dreadfully afraid of syphilis, was also dead. Dr. Sasaki found himself the only doctor in the hospital who was unhurt. Dr. Sasaki, who believed that the enemy had hit only the building he was in, got bandages and began to bind the wounds of those inside the hospital, while outside, all over Hiroshima, maimed and dying citizens turned their unsteady steps towards the Red Cross hospital to begin an invasion that was to make Dr. Sasaki forget his private nightmare for a long, long time. Miss Toshiko Sasaki, the East Asia Tin Works clerk, who was not related to Dr. Sasaki, got up at 3 o'clock in the morning on the day the bomb fell. There was extra housework to do. Her 11-month-old brother, Akio, had come down the day before with a serious stomach upset. Her mother had taken him to the Tamura Pediatric Hospital and was staying there with him. Miss Sasaki, who was about 20, had to cook breakfast for her father, a brother, a sister, and herself, and since the hospital, because of the war, was unable to provide food, to prepare a whole day's meal for her mother and the baby, in time for her father, who worked in a factory making rubber earplugs for artillery crews, to take the food by on his way to the plant. When she had finished and had cleaned and put away the cooking things, it was nearly 7. The family lived in Koi, and she had a 45-minute trip to the tin works in the section of town called Kanonmachi. She was in charge of the personnel records in the factory. She left Koi at 7, and as soon as she reached the plant, she went with some of the other girls from the personnel department to the factory auditorium. A prominent local Navy man, a former employee, had committed suicide the day before by throwing himself under a train, a death considered honorable enough to warrant a memorial service, which was to be held at the tin factory works at 10 o'clock that morning. In the large hall, Miss Sasaki and the others made suitable preparations for the meeting. This work took about 20 minutes. Miss Sasaki went back to her office and sat down at her desk. She was quite far from the windows, which were off to her left, and behind her were a couple of tall bookcases containing all the books of the factory library, which the personnel department had organized. She settled herself at her desk, put some things in a drawer, and shifted papers. She thought that before she began to make entries in her lists of the new employees, discharges, and departures for the army, she would chat for a moment with the girl at her right. Just as she turned her head away from the windows, the room was filled with a blinding light. She was paralyzed by fear, fixed still in her chair for a long moment. The plant was 1,600 yards from the center. Everything fell, and Mrs. Sasaki lost consciousness. The ceiling dropped suddenly, and the wooden floor above collapsed in splinters, and the people up there came down, and the roof above them gave way. But principally, and first of all, the bookcases right behind her swooped forward, and the contents threw her down. With her left leg horribly twisted and breaking underneath her, there in the tin factory, in the first moment of the atomic age, a human being was crushed by books.